There is a moment in a woman's life when the ground gives way so completely that it feels less like loss and more like erasure. What once held meaning collapses without warning, and the identity she carried carefully assembled from expectations, roles, and silent endurance falls into dust. This moment rarely announces itself as transformation. It arrives disguised as devastation. It feels like an ending without dignity, a dismantling without mercy. Yet, beneath the violence of this inner demolition, something else is quietly taking place. What appears to be destruction is often a clearing. What feels like annihilation is frequently preparation. Depth psychology has long understood what modern culture prefers to deny. Suffering is not an interruption to life's purpose, but one of its primary instruments. Within the psyche exists a compensatory intelligence, an unseen balancing force that does not waste pain but absorbs and transforms it. When the conscious mind is overwhelmed by grief, betrayal, illness, or abandonment, the unconscious begins its work. Every sleepless night, every moment of despair, every fracture in the heart is recorded, held, and repurposed by a deeper wisdom that does not operate on the ego's timeline. The soul conducts its alchemy in silence, beyond perception, even as the surface self believes it is simply trying to survive. This is not a sentimental process. It does not arrive with reassurance or gentle affirmations. It is raw, disorienting, and often profoundly lonely. Many women encounter this terrain through losses that feel like amputations, relationships that defined them, roles that structured their worth, bodies that once felt reliable. In these moments, language fails, advice becomes hollow. Well-meaning encouragement dissolves on contact. What remains is a stark stillness, a confrontation with existence stripped of ornament. It is here, in this unclothed reality, that the psyche's deeper laws begin to assert themselves. Carl Jung observed that when the psyche is pushed to an extreme, it initiates a counter-movement from within. He described this as the principle of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposite when carried far enough. When suffering reaches its limits, the unconscious begins generating images, intuitions, and impulses oriented toward balance and renewal. This does not happen because the individual deserves relief, but because the psyche is fundamentally oriented toward wholeness, like a pendulum drawn deep into shadow. The very depth of the descent generates the energy required for return. Ancient myths encoded this truth long before psychology gave it language. Stories of descent, stripping, and symbolic death recur across cultures because they map an inner reality. The goddess who must surrender her power at the gates of the underworld, the bird that must become ash before it can rise. These are not fantasies, but psychological instructions. They reveal that the descent is not a detour from the path, but the path itself. Winter is not a mistake in the cycle, it is the necessary condition for spring. In Jungian terms, this stage is the mortificatio, the symbolic death of the constructed self, the ego identity, the version shaped to be acceptable, capable, unbreakable, cannot accompany the soul any further. Masks dissolve, roles lose relevance. The strong one discovers her limits. The caretaker confronts her own unmet needs. The accommodating woman recognizes the cost of her silence. Pain acts as a solvent, dissolving structures that once felt inseparable from identity. This is not punishment, it is liberation, though it rarely feels that way in the moment. What emerges in this dissolution is not happiness, not clarity, but truth. A woman meets herself without costume or armor, without the familiar narratives that once explained her place in the world. This encounter is terrifying and sacred. It removes the comfort of self-deception and replaces it with radical honesty. Those who have never been broken may live entire lives buffered by illusion. Those who have been shattered lose that luxury. They see what remains when everything extraneous falls away. This first revelation is subtle but irreversible. It marks the beginning of a different relationship with the self, one not built on performance or approval, but on recognition. The psyche, having stripped away what is false, begins to reveal what is essential. This is not yet healing, it is orientation. The woman does not yet know who she is becoming, but she knows with certainty who she is not. Something old has ended, and something unnamed has begun. In this early stage, life often feels suspended between worlds. The past no longer fits. Yet the future has not taken shape. This liminal space is uncomfortable, even frightening, but it is also potent. The old rules no longer apply, and the new ones have not been written. The psyche is reorganizing itself around a deeper center, one that does not depend on external validation or inherited roles. Though the conscious mind may feel lost, the deeper self is already at work, laying the foundations for a transformation that will unfold in its own time. As this in-between state stretches on, the psyche begins to surface material long buried beneath habit and adaptation. Dreams grow vivid, emotions intensify without clear cause, and memories once dismissed as insignificant return with surprising force. This is the shadow making itself known. In Jungian psychology, the shadow is not merely what is dark or destructive, it is everything that was disowned in order to belong, to be safe, to be loved. For many women, this includes anger deemed inappropriate, ambition labeled unfeminine, grief expected to be quickly overcome, and desire that conflicted with duty. Pain breaks the seal that kept these elements underground. What was once suppressed now demands recognition. This confrontation is rarely gentle. The shadow does not arrive as a coherent insight, but as irritation, exhaustion, resentment, or an unfamiliar boldness that unsettles both the woman herself and those around her. The old equilibrium depended on her compliance. As that compliance dissolves, relationships strain. The psyche, however, is not concerned with maintaining comfort. It is concerned with restoring integrity. Integration requires that the split parts be seen, named, and reclaimed. This does not mean acting out every impulse, but it does mean ending the internal exile of vital aspects of the self. As this process unfolds, something remarkable often occurs. Meaningful coincidences begin to cluster at the edges of awareness. Encounters arrive at precisely the right moment. Words overheard resonate with uncanny relevance. Dreams echo waking life in ways that defy rational explanation. Jung called these experiences synchronicities, not as supernatural events, but as expressions of an underlying order that links inner transformation with outer circumstance. They signal that the psyche is aligning, that the individual is moving closer to her authentic path. Life begins to feel responsive again, as if it is participating in her becoming. Alongside this shift comes a new quality of presence. Women who have passed through profound suffering often carry a stillness that is immediately perceptible. It is not detachment, nor is it resignation. It is a groundedness born from having reached the bottom and survived. The frantic urgency that once drove decisions begins to loosen. There is less need to prove, to impress, to justify existence. Time slows, attention deepens. The nervous system, having been forced into the present by crisis, retains that capacity even as the acute pain recedes. Ordinary moments regain texture and weight. This presence alters how the world is perceived. Pleasure is no longer taken for granted. Silence becomes tolerable, even nourishing. There is an emerging trust in inner guidance, a sense that not everything must be planned or controlled. The ego, once desperate for certainty, learns to coexist with ambiguity. This is not passivity, but maturity. It reflects a growing alignment with what Jung described as the self, the larger organizing center of the psyche that transcends the narrow aims of the ego. The ego seeks safety and recognition. The self seeks growth and realization, even when the path is uncomfortable. In this phase, many women recognize that the life they built was shaped more by expectation than by desire. Strength was performed at the expense of truth. Harmony was maintained through self-erasure. Success was pursued without asking whether it nourished the soul. Pain disrupts these arrangements because they cannot survive contact with authenticity. As the false structures dissolve, a quieter, more resilient sense of worth begins to emerge. It does not depend on being needed or admired. It rests on self-recognition. This shift often brings with it a reconfiguration of relationships. Some connections weaken or end altogether, not through conflict but through misalignment. The woman is no longer available for dynamics that require her to shrink, explain, or endure. This can provoke guilt, particularly in those long conditioned to prioritize others' comfort, yet this boundary is not cruelty. It is self-respect. New connections begin to form, drawn not to performance, but to presence. These relationships tend to be fewer but deeper, grounded in resonance rather than obligation. As the shadow integrates and the psyche stabilizes around a more authentic center, hidden capacities come to light. Creativity long suppressed finds expression. Intuition sharpens, no longer drowned out by external noise. An unexpected capacity to hold space for others emerges, not from training or theory, but from lived understanding. This is the archetype of the wounded healer, not as a role to adopt, but as a natural consequence of having traversed the inner landscape with honesty. The wound becomes a source of wisdom precisely because it has been inhabited rather than bypassed. This stage does not mark completion, it marks consolidation. The woman is no longer merely enduring transformation, she is beginning to embody it. The psyche, having survived fragmentation, reorganizes itself around wholeness rather than perfection. Light and shadow coexist without denial. Strength includes vulnerability. Authority arises from self-trust rather than control. The old self is no longer something to return to, and the new self, though still forming, is no longer frightening. There is an emerging sense that the descent had purpose, even if its meaning is not yet fully articulated. As the psyche continues its reorganization, a deeper reconciliation begins to take place. The inner opposites that once warred strength and softness, desire and duty, fear and courage start to lose their rigid boundaries. Jung described this movement as the approach toward the union of opposites, a stage in which the personality no longer fragments itself in the attempt to be acceptable or safe. Instead, it learns to contain contradiction without collapse. This is not a sudden enlightenment, but a gradual easing of internal conflict. The woman no longer needs to exile parts of herself to maintain coherence. She becomes complex without becoming chaotic. With this integration comes a profound shift in authority. Decisions are no longer outsourced to external approval or inherited scripts. The inner voice, once faint or dismissed, acquires weight. This is not impulsivity, it is discernment forged through experience. Having survived what once seemed unbearable, the psyche recalibrates its sense of threat and importance. Much of what once provoked anxiety is revealed as noise. What remains essential becomes unmistakably clear. There is a new confidence in saying no, not as rejection, but as alignment. This inner authority reshapes the woman's relationship with time. Before the descent, life may have been organized around urgency, achievement, recovery, explanation, improvement. Pain disrupts this orientation because it collapses the future into the present. In the depths of suffering, there is only now. And in that forced presence, a revelation quietly takes root. Life is never elsewhere. As the psyche heals, this awareness persists. The woman moves more slowly, but with greater precision. She listens differently. She notices subtleties once drowned out by striving. Time becomes a space to inhabit rather than an enemy to outrun. This change in tempo has consequences. The mundane acquires texture. A cup of coffee is not consumed but experienced. A conversation is not endured but entered. Silence is no longer something to fill. In this attentiveness, meaning begins to surface in unexpected places, not as grand answers, but as a sense of rightness, a felt coherence between inner state and outer action. The psyche rewards presence with depth. What once felt empty becomes alive. As this embodiment deepens, the woman's capacity for compassion transforms. It is no longer driven by obligation or self-sacrifice, but by recognition. Having encountered her own darkness without turning away, she is no longer threatened by the suffering of others. She does not rush to fix, minimize, or reframe. She can sit with pain without needing to resolve it. This quality is rare and immediately felt. It creates a field of safety not through reassurance, but through honesty. Others sense that their experience will not be judged or dismissed in her presence. This compassion is not sentimental. It does not blur boundaries or excuse harm. It meets others at eye level, neither above nor below, in Jungian terms. It arises from the integration of the shadow, from the refusal to project disowned aspects onto others. Because she has faced her own fear, rage, and grief, she no longer needs to locate them elsewhere. This reduces reactivity and deepens understanding. Her presence becomes steady, grounded, and quietly transformative. At this stage, relationships continue to evolve. Connections based on shared masks or mutual avoidance lose their vitality. Those built on authenticity strengthen. The woman no longer tolerates intimacy that requires self-betrayal. This selectivity is often misunderstood as withdrawal or coldness, but it is neither. It is discernment. Energy is finite, and the psyche now invests it where there is reciprocity and depth. This is not loneliness, it is integrity. The question of meaning, once abstract, becomes embodied. Viktor Frankl observed that meaning is not found but lived, created through response to circumstance, having been stripped of illusions. The woman is now capable of answering life from a deeper place. Purpose is no longer equated with productivity or recognition. It emerges through alignment, through actions that reflect inner truth. This purpose may express itself quietly, through presence rather than proclamation. It may take time to articulate, but it is felt as direction, as coherence, as a sense of participating in something larger than the ego's concerns. The individuation process, as Jung described it, has no final destination. It unfolds across a lifetime, punctuated by moments of clarity and integration. What the woman has gained is not immunity from future pain, but resilience and trust. She knows now that suffering is not evidence of failure, but a summons to deeper alignment. She has seen that the psyche contains its own intelligence, one that guides through darkness toward expansion. This knowledge alters how future challenges are met. There is less panic, less resistance. Even uncertainty carries a different weight. The woman understands that breakdown and breakthrough are not opposites, but partners in transformation. She has lived this truth in her own body and psyche. The descent did not destroy her, it revealed her. As the transformation settles into lived reality, the woman begins to recognize a quiet but radical shift in how she relates to herself. Gratitude, once reserved for what was pleasant or successful, expands to include what was once unbearable. This gratitude is not naive and it is not forced. It arises organically, born from the recognition that without the fire, the old form would have remained intact, and the deeper self would have stayed buried. The pain does not retroactively become gentle, but it becomes meaningful. It takes its place as a necessary chapter in a larger story that now makes sense. This is one of the most difficult thresholds to cross. To acknowledge that what nearly broke her, also forged her, requires a maturity that cannot be rushed. It is not about justifying harm or romanticizing suffering. It is about seeing clearly. The psyche, when viewed from a wider lens, reveals its inherent purposefulness. Nothing essential was wasted. Every tear, every collapse, every moment of isolation contributed to the shaping of a self that is more grounded, more compassionate, more real than before. This realization does not erase grief, but it changes its texture. Grief becomes integrated rather than overwhelming. With this integration comes a new relationship to fate. What once felt like betrayal by life begins to feel like initiation. There is an emerging capacity to say, without bitterness or denial, that the path unfolded as it needed to. This is not submission. It is sovereignty. The woman no longer measures her worth by how little she has suffered, but by how honestly she has lived through what was given. She no longer needs to rewrite the past to survive it. She can let it stand, complete and imperfect. This internal shift radiates outward. Others perceive it even if they cannot name it. There is a depth in her gaze, a steadiness in her presence that was not there before. It is not hardness, it is not armor, it is solidity. She has touched the bedrock of her own being and found it capable of holding her. This knowing cannot be taken away. It becomes a quiet anchor in every storm that follows. As this presence stabilizes, the woman's influence on others changes. She no longer teaches through advice or performance, but through embodiment. Her life becomes evidence that transformation is possible, that one can walk through darkness without becoming consumed by it. She does not advertise her resilience, it is simply felt. In a world obsessed with numbing pain or bypassing it, this authenticity is rare and magnetic. People are drawn to it because it offers permission to be real. Compassion, at this depth, becomes effortless. It is no longer something she does, but something she is. Having befriended her own shadow, she does not flinch at the shadow in others. She can sit with discomfort without rushing to resolve it. This does not make her a savior or a martyr. It makes her a witness, and often, that is what heals most deeply. Her presence communicates, without words. That survival is possible and that meaning can be forged from chaos. Time itself continues to soften. The frantic need to arrive somewhere dissolves. Life is no longer experienced as a series of obstacles to overcome, but as a landscape to inhabit. The woman understands now that depth cannot be rushed. She trusts the pacing of her own unfolding. This patience is not complacency. It is alignment. She moves when it is time to move. She rests when it is time to rest. She listens for what wants to emerge rather than forcing outcomes. Meaning, once sought as an answer, now reveals itself as a practice. It is created daily through choices that reflect inner truth. The question of purpose no longer demands a single declaration. It unfolds through lived integrity. Each time she chooses honesty over approval, presence over performance, depth over distraction. Meaning consolidates. The path continues to reveal itself step by step, not through certainty, but through resonance. The transformation does not conclude with resolution. There is no final version of the self to arrive at. There is only continued becoming. Future losses will come, new descents will occur. But the woman now carries a knowing that changes everything. She knows that life is not trying to destroy her, it is trying to shape her, and she no longer resists the shaping with the same fear. She understands that within every crisis lies the seed of a deeper alignment. She stands now at a threshold that is not dramatic, but profound. The old self has ended. The new self is no longer hypothetical. It is lived. The reward for the suffering was never external. It was not success, recognition, or even happiness. It was the reclamation of her own essence. What remains after the stone has been chipped away is something indestructible, something true, and that truth is enough. What ultimately emerges from this long interior passage is not a perfected self, but a sovereign one. A woman who has walked through the dismantling of her former identity does not come back seeking applause or permission. She returns with an inner authority that is quiet, embodied, and unshakable. This authority does not announce itself. It does not dominate. It simply knows. It knows what matters and what does not. It knows when to engage and when to step back. It knows that intuition is not a fragile whisper, but a form of intelligence refined through experience. This is the moment Jung described as the reconciliation of opposites, when the psyche no longer fragments itself to maintain an illusion of purity or control. Light and shadow coexist without denial. Strength no longer excludes tenderness. Vulnerability no longer threatens power. The woman understands that she is not meant to be all good or all composed, but whole. This acceptance of paradox brings a peace that is not numbness, but clarity. Resistance to life softens. Reality is no longer fought, it is met. From this place, suffering is no longer interpreted as personal failure. It is understood as initiation. This does not make future pain easier, but it makes it intelligible. The woman has learned, through direct experience, that the psyche does not lead into darkness without also preparing a way through it. She has survived what once felt unsurvivable. That knowledge lives in her body now, not as bravado, but as trust. She trusts herself. She trusts the process. She trusts that even when meaning is obscured, it is not absent. This trust transforms how she shows up in the world. She is less reactive, less compelled to explain herself, less dependent on external affirmation. Her worth is no longer negotiable. It is assumed. This does not isolate her. It refines her connections. Relationships become fewer, but more real. She no longer trades intimacy for belonging. She no longer abandons herself to maintain peace. This is not hardness. It is self-respect. Compassion, at this stage, reaches its most mature form. It is no longer fueled by the need to be needed or the fear of rejection. It arises naturally from recognition. Because she has faced her own abyss, she can sit with others in theirs without flinching. She does not rush them toward resolution. She does not offer false optimism. She offers presence. And presence, when it is grounded and unafraid, is profoundly healing. Her very being communicates that pain can be endured without becoming an identity. The woman now understands that her scars are not evidence of weakness, but proof of initiation. They are the credentials of her wisdom. She carries within her the archetype of the wounded healer, not as a role to perform, but as a lived reality. She does not heal by fixing, she heals by being. In a culture that prizes speed, certainty, and constant positivity, this depth is rare. It is also desperately needed. Time, too, has changed its meaning. The frantic urgency of before has given way to attentiveness. The present moment is no longer a hurdle to clear on the way to something else. It is the place where life actually happens. This presence transforms the ordinary into something sacred. The woman no longer measures her life by milestones alone, but by moments of alignment, moments when inner truth and outer action converge. Meaning, once sought as an answer, is now lived as a process. It is created through choices that honor authenticity over performance, through courage that does not announce itself, through the willingness to remain open despite having been hurt. The path continues to unfold, not as a straight line, but as a deepening spiral. There is no final arrival. There is only continued becoming. What she knows now, with a certainty that cannot be unlearned, is that life was never trying to break her. It was trying to forge her. Every descent carried the seed of a wider consciousness. Every loss stripped away what was false. What remains is not invulnerability, but truth. Not perfection, but presence. Not a mask, but a face turned honestly toward life. This is the hidden reward of suffering, not something added, but something revealed. The authentic self that was always there, waiting beneath layers of conditioning, expectation, and fear. The pain was the chisel. What remains is the essence, and that essence is indestructible. If these words resonated with you, if you recognized your own journey somewhere within them, take a moment to acknowledge where you are on this path. Share your reflections in the comments. Your insight may be the mirror someone else needs as they navigate their own darkness. If you found value here, like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and subscribe for more explorations of depth, transformation, and inner truth. This space is for those willing to do the real work, the slow work, the courageous work of becoming whole.